Hey everybody, so I am going to do a lecture here that's on chapter 8. It's mainly sort of an outline of what the book has so that you don't get too confused as opposed to me popping in and lecturing at the last moment, but with a little bit of a blend of my lecture. Now, this is going to be a fairly lengthy video, probably 50 minutes, so you might want to break it up, come back and forth to it at certain times. So first off, let's really define what a political party is. And this is what this chapter is on. It's about parties and campaigns. And we're going to hit some of the highlights here. Now, a political party can be defined, and this is similar to your book, as a group of people who organize and to seek to control the personnel and policies of government. And so how do you organize and control the personnel and policies of government? Well, the way you do it is you win elections, right? You get your candidates in elected office. Once you do that, you control the policies of government. Now, as your book says that U.S. parties, they run campaigns that are party centered. And there's a lot of truth to that, that a lot of people will straight ticket vote. And so depending on where you are, people will vote for you mainly because you're a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Now, in Texas recently, we've tried to get away from that by outlawing, I don't say outlawing, getting rid of the straight ticket button on the ballot. This was a push done by Republicans in Texas because they felt there were a lot of people that were signing up as a member of the Republican Party who really weren't Republicans and getting elected because they had an R by their name. But campaigns can also be candidate-centered, and I think candidate-centered elections often are usually at your local level, where those are nonpartisan, mayors, city council, school boards, and a lot of times even at your county level where they are partisan elections, but you know the individual, and so they became individually centered or candidate centered. So what are the roles of parties? What do parties do? Well, one of the things that parties do is, and maybe one of their most important functions, is they recruit and nominate candidates for public office. You ever think about running for office? Go down to your party headquarters. They'll probably find a place for you to run. If you voted in the last election, you probably saw, jeepers, there were a lot of positions that were unopposed. Now, I will give you a little hint on my voting preferences that when they're unopposed, I skip that election. I only vote in competitive elections. So they recruit and nominate candidates. Now, parties also will come up with what we call policy ideas. They come up with new policies, and they come up with these policies and present it to the voter in what they call the party platform. A party platform is just a statement of what the party believes in and what they believe they would like to do when they get into government. And so when you see a platform, it's what the party stands for. And each issue of the platform is known as a plank. So you put a lot of planks together, you get a platform. That's how that works out. So you might have a plank on immigration, you might have a plank on defense, you might have a plank on Medicare or healthcare or whatever, the environment. Put all the planks together, just like if you were building a platform, and you get a platform. Parties will also generate enthusiasm in a campaign. That's one of the things that they do today. I mean, if you see this last election that we just got through, there was a lot of enthusiasm on both sides. We had I think the highest turnout they suspect since the 1906, I think I saw. And even then, that's 60%, which means 40% of the Americans did not vote. But they do generate enthusiasm. Parties also allow voters to express their opinion on past public policy. That's how you tend to vote, because you don't know the future, right? You don't know what's going to happen. So, for example, in this election, if you voted for Trump, you liked what he did the last 4 years. If you voted for Biden, you didn't like what he did the last 4 years. And this is sometimes called retrospective judgment or retrospective voting. You're looking at the past to determine who you want to vote for and how they behaved. Now, parties will also educate people. One of the ideas of parties is they want to educate you on the issues. They want to bring up issues to your attention so that you can learn about them. Now, of course, you always take a grain of salt, whatever any party tells you. You should always do independent verification, because sometimes it's, not altogether true. So parties also act as watchdogs. They keep an eye on the other party so that if something's going wrong, they're going to make sure you know about it. This is sometimes referred to as the loyal opposition. Yeah, that makes sense, right? The loyal opposition, keep it on the other side. Now, parties are also linkage institutions. This means that they are the link between the will of the people and the government, right? Because you're electing people to run that government. Now, let's talk about the characteristics, organization of American parties. And this is sort of interesting. I always like it. So let's start about talking about the characteristics of the American party system. Well, first off, it's been characterized by a two-party system. Now, the reason we have a two-party system, we should point out, is because the election system that we run, and we use what we call a first past the post and a single member district system, which tends to lend itself to two-party systems. Now, I'm going to post a separate video on why the two-party system lends itself, or single member districts and plurality elections lends itself to a two-party system. After this one, it's a short little video. It's done by a man by CPG Gray. It's very easily informative. And maybe even what are the alternatives to that? But the single member districts and plurality elections means that we trend to a two-party system. Single member district means that you only get to elect one member of Congress, just one, that's it. And then plurality elections, are sometimes known as first past the post, is whoever gets the most votes wins. You don't need a majority in a general election, you just need a plurality. And remember that a plurality, simply put, is whoever gets the most votes. It doesn't have to be a majority, it's whoever gets the most votes. Now, so let's talk about the history of American Party, since we've said it's a two-party tradition. If we were going to go way, 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 way back to the battle for ratification, you could argue that your beginnings of parties, what we might call proto-parties, would have been over the battle for ratification of the Constitution. You had one group, the Federalists, who favored the new Constitution. You had another group called the Anti-Federalists, who opposed the new Constitution. They're not really parties as such, right? Because they're not running candidates for office. And then once the Constitution is ratified, these parties disappear. But parties reemerged during the Washington presidency. And this is one of the interesting things here about the founders. They really didn't think we'd have parties. They thought maybe we all agree and pick a leader. That seems rather naive today, right? Is that just me? I think so. But we end up having parties mainly because of two questions. And I know this is going to shock you, but these are really the same two questions we argue about today. It really is. And the two questions are, what's the meaning of the Constitution? And what's the role of the government? Break down this last election, and that's really what you're talking about. What is the meaning of the Constitution? And now you might think, well, it's pretty easy to understand. Horse hockey, pardon my language. But if you look at the necessary and proper clause that empowers the government to do all things necessary and proper to carry out its delegated functions, what does it mean, necessary and proper? Or if you look at the Fourth Amendment, it says your protection against unreasonable search and seizure. What is meant by unreasonable, right? We can argue about those things until we're blue in the face. And so, and then when we talk about the role of the government, what is the role of the government? Is the government's job to provide healthcare? Is it the government's job to protect the environment? Is the government's job to make sure there's auto safety? These are things that when the founders created this Constitution, they really had no clue of future problems. And so we're always asking, what is that role of the government? And so during the Washington presidency, we get two groups that spring up primarily over these two questions. Now, one of them are going to be called the Federalists, and they're led by Alexander Hamilton. We all know Hamilton. You probably saw the musical, right? And the famous song, "In the Room Where It Happens." I think nowadays with COVID, we have to say "in the Zoom where it happens." And then the other group is going to be the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. Now, sometimes these two factions are known by their leaders, the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. But why these two groups? And let's just take a few moments to talk about what are their differences? What makes them separate? All right, let's go through it. So, for example, the Federalists believed in a strong central government. They thought that the central government should have the most power. They didn't really have a lot of faith in the states, especially after the Articles of Confederation that seemed weak and ineffective. And so they favored a strong central government. Now, the Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonians believe that states should have the most power, that you should have a much weaker federal government. The Federalists believed in a manufacturing society. They wanted the United States to be a manufacturing society. Hamilton and other Federalists said, look, you look around the world, Britain and France, they're the most powerful countries in the world. And what are they? They manufacture things. The United States didn't do that. Whereas the Democratic Republicans said, no, we need to be an agrarian society. We need to be a group of farmers because, if you look at the most corrupt powers, Britain and France, you'd say it's because they're manufacturing, because the manufacturing era in those two countries led to slums and almost the Dickensian workplace where children were working long, long hours. And so, Jefferson said there was nothing more noble than a man working the land, or in Jefferson's case, enslaving somebody else to work the land for him. And the idea of being an agrarian or farming society is that even in the tough times, people would be able to feed themselves. Now, the Federalists also believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, that there was a lot more powers in the Constitution that are just listed there, like the creation of a national bank, which you probably studied in a previous unit. The Democratic Republicans were more of what you might call a strict constructionist or a statist, if you will. And you hear that today, even with our new Supreme Court justice, who said that she wants to go back to what the original intent is. I just don't really think they're really true originalists. It's hard to do. But they believed that the Constitution was what it said. There was nothing else in there. There were no additional power. Now, of course, when Jefferson becomes president, he flips on that and comes up with some additional powers. Politicians, can you really trust them? Wait a minute, I'm a politician. Can you trust me? Probably not. So then the Federalists wanted close ties with Great Britain. They liked that British law and order. Wait, sorry, I was waiting for that law and order sound to go off. They liked that unwritten constitution. They liked that traditional of rights. Whereas the Democratic Republicans, and not surprising here because Jefferson had been ambassador to France, liked close ties with France. France was our first ally. They had a revolution to get rid of their monarchy with liberty, equality, and fraternity, that whole thing. They wanted close ties with France. And then finally, the other difference we should mention is that the Hamiltonians wanted high voting qualifications. They didn't want just anybody voting. They wanted to make sure that there were landowners voting. Their philosophy was, if you don't own land, why do you get to elect people to tell us what we can do with our land? The Jeffersonians, or Democratic Republicans, believed in lower voting qualifications. They expand the vote. Now, when I say expand the vote, they're not meaning minorities or women. They just mean white men who may not own land. So when you look at those two groups, and I ask this question all the time, is who wins out? Well, clearly, who's got a Broadway musical after him? Who's on the $10 bill and was never president? It clearly was Hamilton. Hamilton was the financial genius of the early United States. And so the Hamilton view wins out over the long run. So these are the two parties that arise. And then there's only going to be one Federalist president. That's John Adams, and he ends up being a one-termer. The Federalist Party will eventually disappear. They run their last Federalist candidate for president in 1816, Rufus King. And the reason that the Federalist Party disappeared, there's a couple of reasons. One, their leader, Alexander Hamilton, suffers a slight political setback when he's shot and killed by the vice president. That always put the kibosh on your career. And then, and I don't want to go too far into detail, we do this in a history class that I teach, the War of 1812, when the Federalists, who were based primarily in the New England states, and the War of 1812 had really impacted the New England states, the Federalists got together at a place called the Hartford Convention and said, we're going to really, go down and tell little Jimmy Madison, which is what they called him, the what for about this war. And then when they got to Washington, the war was over. And it was being treated as an American victory. So the Federalists looked like they were stupid, traitors, unpatriotic at best, right? And so they fade away. And so between 1816 and 1824, during the presidency of James Monroe, there's only one party, the Democratic Republican Party. It's the only party. This is sometimes known as the era of good feelings, right? Because there's only one party. There's no division. It's so good for the president, James Monroe, is that when Monroe runs for re-election in 1820, he runs unopposed. Now imagine that today, right? A president running unopposed. It's amazing. Now, he doesn't get all the Electoral College votes, however. Why not? Well, because there were at least three who said, look, we like James Monroe, but Washington was the only one to do this unanimously, and we want to maintain that as a singular honor for George Washington. So, hang on, I'm going to put this on pause for just a second so I can grab a drink of water. I'm back. So, in 1824, Monroe had served 2 terms, and Washington had said, hey, I think 2 terms is enough. That wasn't a constitutional limitation at this time and won't be until the 22nd Amendment in the 1950s. So Monroe says, I'm going to step down. Well, there's only one party, right? The Democratic Republicans. But in the election of 1824, there are going to be 4 candidates for president. And we'll go through them real quick. One is Senator Andrew Jackson. Jackson is a war hero. And in fact, when ever asked about why we should elect him president, he'd just say war hero. If you asked him, hey, what do you think about the national bank? He'd say war hero. Hey, how's the weather today? War hero, right? And this is at a time where it was very unseemly for candidates to actually campaign. Your job was to sort of say, well, I really don't want it, but if required to serve, I'll serve, blah, blah, blah. So Jackson's there, making his name from the War of 1812. Next up the list is the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. Now, he's considered the odds-on favorite. Why is he considered the odds-on favorite? Because if you look at the office of Secretary of State, Jefferson had been Secretary of State and became president. Madison had been Secretary of State and became president. Monroe had become Secretary of State and became president. And John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State for James Monroe. So everybody thinks, okay, I like this guy. Maybe he's the next president. And John Quincy Adams believed in what he called the American system. I know, how can you hate that, right? And that was an idea of protective tariffs, building more internal improvements like canals and roads, maybe even creating a national university. That was the American system. He doesn't say a lot about it. He was always sort of a quiet guy anyway. But he is a supporter of it. Next up is William Crawford. Now, Crawford is the Secretary of the Treasury out of Georgia, brilliant man, but early on he suffers a bit of a stroke. And he's a states' rights advocate, so he's not going to be as much of a player. And then last but not least, it's going to be Henry Clay. And Henry Clay is one of these people that you probably don't know a lot about, but was really a big player, or as you young people say, playa. Okay, I won't ever do that again, I'm sorry. In the 1850s. He was the Speaker of the House. All right. And he's really big on the American system. He's a big proponent of it because he's from Kentucky, and the American system would be building roads out that way to Kentucky, which means that Kentuckians could get manufactured goods, plus they'd be able to ship their goods a lot easier back east to be sold. Well, when the Electoral College results come back, and I know I have this fairly clearly, I might be off by one on one of them. Jackson gets 99 Electoral College votes. John Quincy Adams gets 83. And then Crawford gets 41 and Clay gets 38. Now, to win the presidency, you've got to get a majority of the Electoral College vote. And if you add those numbers up, I believe that adds up to 260, so you have to get 131. Well, nobody has 131, right? Jackson's got 99. He doesn't have a majority, he has a plurality. Well, what the Constitution says at this point is that if nobody gets a majority Electoral College votes, then that means it has to go to the House of Representatives, with each state getting one vote, right? Well, clearly you weren't going to pick Crawford because of his health. Clay came in last. You certainly wouldn't pick him. So it's really between Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Now, the person who's going to have a big say in this is, of course, Henry Clay. He's the Speaker of the House, right? And so he's going to have a sway over who's going to be elected president. Well, Clay hates Jackson. He thinks that Jackson is only well known for killing people and doesn't like him at all. And he's able to get the House of Representatives to elect John Quincy Adams as president. So when you think about people like, say, Hillary Clinton, who won the popular vote but lost the election, or Al Gore, who won the popular vote and lost the election, and you think they're mad, think about Andrew Jackson, right? He got the most popular votes. He got more Electoral College votes than anybody else, and he's not president. And, he says, well, that's a bit of a head scratcher. How does that happen? Well, he thinks he gets his answer when John Quincy Adams names as his Secretary of State Henry Clay. And for them, they say, Jackson and his folks, I see what happened here. This is what they called a corrupt bargain, that there was a deal made behind closed doors. That's what they think. We don't really have a lot of evidence of that. That, John Quincy Adams went to Henry Clay and said, get me elected president, I'll make you Secretary of State, and you can be the next president. It's probably doubtful that it happened. Even Clay's supporters said, don't take the Secretary of State's job. You're a great administrator. You're not, you're a great legislator, but not necessarily administrator. But he does. And this whole idea that there was some sort of, this was a rigged election somehow, sticks on those two, and John Quincy Adams is only going to be a one-term president. But what it does do is it breaks up the Democratic Republican Party. Jackson will no longer support the party after the election, and so we get two groups emerge. John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay take one group and rename themselves the National Republicans. Jackson takes what's left of the Democratic Republicans, simplifies their names, right, and calls them the Democratic Party. And it's the Democratic Party that exists today. Now, of course, it stands for completely different things, just like the Republican Party does, that we get created in 1854. But it's the one party that's been around in one shape or form or another since the beginning. Well, the National Republicans aren't going to have a lot of success. John Quincy Adams is a one-term president. Jackson turns around and defeats him in a particularly nasty campaign in 1828, where Jackson begins using what he calls a grassroots party, where he organized the party primarily at the local level. And Jackson will be able to serve 2 terms as president. Now, it's interesting with Jackson, our last president, Donald Trump, said he always liked Jackson. Jackson was, and see the ideas behind why you might like a particular president. When you look at Jackson, Jackson is primarily a president that is well known for conflict, whether that's the Peggy Eaton affair, whether that's the war on the National Bank, the nullification crisis, his disputes with Calhoun and Clay, the Maysville Road Bill. It's all about conflict with Jackson, right? And, Trump also tried to play that way. And sometimes you can be very successful in that kind of a strategy of conflict. Jackson was very successful. Jackson wins 2 terms, and he's even able to pick his own successor in Martin Van Buren. Not as successful for Donald Trump, successful for one election, but apparently not for another. But candidates have often tried to use that as a strategy, and sometimes to greater success than other candidates. But Jackson becomes very powerful as a president. He's very powerful. He appeals to the masses. They love him. And there's a group of people that don't like Jackson. And they don't like him either. It's because of the nullification crisis, the bank war, you name it. There's a lot of reasons why they don't like Jackson. In fact, they call him King Andrew the First, right? That he's become like a dictator in their mind and a bit of a demagogue. And in England, those who support the king were known as Tories. But those who supported parliamentary democracy and the power of the legislature were known as, and you're probably guessing this right now, Whigs. And so we get a new party in the United States. The National Republicans fade away, and we get a new party called the WIG Party. And it's an interesting party. It's a party that's shaped primarily around the hatred of Andrew Jackson. I mean, it's a broad coalition of people, and they primarily hate Jackson. So the Whig Party will have some success. Jackson only serves 2 terms, right, like you're supposed to. And the Whigs will run their first presidential candidates in 1832. It's interesting, they run 3, Hugh Lawson White, Daniel Webster, and William Henry Harrison, and they lose to Martin Van Buren. But for Van Buren, he was unlucky. He was Jackson's successor, and some of Jackson's policy led to the economy crashing, and it crashed as soon as Martin Van Buren became into office, and we had a 3rd unemployment. But in 1840, the Whigs win their first presidential race with William Henry Harrison. And this where it gets tricky, right? Because we all know William Henry Harrison for one thing, and that's that he took his oath of office in the rain, and then he died 30 days later, the shortest ever. And then was his vice president for the first time a vice president took over, and that was John Tyler in 1841. Now, a little bit of trivia that you don't need to know, but Tyler later was in the Confederacy Congress. He had a child with a much younger wife, and then his son had a child with a much younger wife. And until recently, until October 20th or September 20th, one of the two, I think it was October 20th of this year, 2 of John Tyler's grandchildren were still alive. So imagine that. You could say my grandfather was president in 1841. But one of them just recently died, but he still has one left over. So your dad was president 180 years ago, your grandfather was? That's pretty amazing stuff. But the Whigs will nominate another presidential candidate and win in 1848 when they nominate Zachary Taylor, who unfortunately a year and a half into office dies as well. So if anybody ever asks you to be the next Whig president, don't do it. The Whigs will fall apart in 1854 over the issue of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was the slavery issue. Pro-slavery Whigs will join up with Democrats. These pro-slavery Whigs were sometimes known as Cotton Whigs. Anti-slavery Whigs, mainly in the North, were known as Conscience Whigs. And they'll join up with different parties, and several parties float around. There's a fusion party, there's an anti-Nebraska party, there's a People's Party, but they eventually come together and call themselves, out of a simplicity, the Republican Party. And that's the birth of the American Republican Party in 1854. They run their first candidate, John Fremont, also known as the Pathfinder, famous for the Mexican-American War. Great slogan, free speech, free men, and Fremont, right? Come on, that's better than anything that you got this time, right? Trump, Pence, Biden, Harris. Boring. That's pretty cool. And the Republicans will nominate again in 1860 and win their first presidential election when they nominate and elect Abraham Lincoln as the first Republican president. And since that time, and what your book will tend to do is divide it up between periods of Republican dominance and periods of Democratic dominance, and they'll call these party systems. So let's talk about third parties. You hear this a lot, right? Why don't we have a third party? And I've already explained part of that is because of single member districts and plurality elections. Well, we have third parties, and we've always had third parties for the most part. In the 1830s, we had a third party, somewhat of a conspiratorial third party known as the Anti-Masonic Party, who believed that Freemasons were running the country and it was a secret cabal. Pardon me. But in 1840, we had a party called the Liberty Party, which was the first anti-slavery party, and they nominated a presidential candidate in James G. Birney. But it's a very minor party and doesn't go very far. We have a Free Soil Party in the 1840s. Its impact is what a lot of third party impact is that they can swing a vote in a particular state and let one party win. The Free Soil Party did that actually in 1848 in the election in New York that allowed Zachary Taylor to beat William Cass. Then we've had third parties like the Greenback Party, the Know Nothing Party, we've had a Socialist Party, a Communist Party, we have a Green Party, which is an environmental party, and we have a Libertarian Party. A lot of times we have a Natural Law Party, we have a Workers' Family Party. I mean, there are a lot of different parties out there. In fact, my mom was shocked when she went to vote in New York and she saw these parties. She goes, "Where are these people from?" I go, "Minor parties. You get on the ballot by paying a fee usually, and you can get on the ballot." So we've had a lot of these parties. Oh, and the Reform Party. And what's interesting, and I haven't taken a look at it, is that if you go right now and look on some of these pages about the votes in these states, especially the close votes, there was a Libertarian candidate, and she did well in some states. And if there wasn't a Libertarian candidate, would have some of those states swung over for Trump and shifted the election. Hard to say, right? Because we don't know necessarily that if Libertarians didn't have a candidate, would they vote Trump or Biden, or some would, some won't, but we don't know what that break would be. But we'll leave it to somebody else to do all that math and statistical analysis because we're busy trying to get through this class. So third parties struggle. They struggle because of our election system. They struggle because it's very expensive to start a third party across the country. They struggle because they're usually one issue parties, and then one of the other parties takes up their issue and they get absorbed into that party. So yeah, we've had third parties for such a long time in this country. So there's nothing new. The question is, how do we get to a point that they can win? Now, when we see party dominance on one side or the other, this is often referred to as realignment. You'll see a realignment of people going from one party to another. That's what realignment means, people going from one party to another. You for example, like in the 1980s, you saw a lot of Democrats in a period of realignment going from being Democrats to becoming Reagan Republicans, right? Or in the 1930s, African Americans used to vote in large numbers for the Republican Party, but then that realignment occurred and they started voting for the Democratic Party. So realignment is people moving from one party to the other, and sometimes you can use it on a state level, of states realigning to another side. So, there was a lot of talk about, would Texas realign this election? Would it become blue? Because it's been a red state. And Democrats had high hopes, and that didn't happen. I mean, when you look at Texas in this last election, for the most part, it was a complete disaster for Texas Democrats. Tarrant County and across the state. They had hoped to gain control of the state legislature. So that realignment hasn't happened, but it might. We see the demographics changing over a period of time. Now, there's also what we call de-alignment. And de-alignment is when people move from one party, I mean, they move away from all parties. They decide, look, I don't like parties. I'm going to call myself an independent. And we see a little bit more of that. I mean, in the past, people lined up as a party because the party was your primary source of information about politics. Well, of course, today there's a lot of different sources that you can find out. But keep in mind this too, that when people say that they are independents, they're really not independents. They're either liberals, they're either Republicans or Democrats. They just like to say that they're independents. All right. So when we look at American party systems and this two-party system, we could change that if we wanted to. In places like Europe, they'll have, like Italy has 46 parties. And you do that by moving away from single member districts to multi-member districts, where you don't just elect one person, you get to elect several people. Usually you elect a party. You vote for a party and the party has a list of names, and if they get 5 seats, then the top 5 names go. And then they add in what they call proportional representation, meaning that if you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats. You get 2% of the vote, you get 2% of the seats, so that every party gets some representation in the legislature. That's going to be difficult for us to do in this country. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but who knows? Okay. Another characteristic of American political parties is that they tend to be non-class and historically have been non-ideological. Non-class means that you can be rich and be a Democrat, rich and be a Republican, or poor and be a Democrat and poor and be a Republican, working class or blue collar or white collar and be in either party. Now, you might be thinking, well, duh, Brian, that makes perfect sense. But that's not true in some places. In some places, if you're a workers' party, you have to be a member of a working class. You cannot be a banker. And we've had that a couple times in the United States where you'd have parties that did not allow people like sellers of alcohol, lawyers, bankers, not allowed to member of the party. But in the United States, that's not the case. And when I say non-ideological, there's really nothing you have to believe to be a member of the party, right? You can believe anything you want to, because what do you have to do to be a member of a party? All you have to do in the United States is just say, I'm a member of this party, and you're a member, right? That's different in some other places. Other places you have to pay dues and you have to be accepted into the party, but not in the United States. You can go, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Green Party, I'm a Libertarian. You can just say whatever you want to say. So what parties try to do, and your book says this, that they really try to build a broad coalition. I think we're moving away from that, and I think studies will be showing that, is that they're not so much interested in a broad coalition, because a lot of these elections are determined in primaries. And what you try to do is create a strong base of a certain group and get them out to vote. And even in this election, I would argue that the president's strategy, President Trump's strategy, was not to expand his base to include other groups, but to take that base that helped him get elected the first time and find more like-minded people that were just the same as that base and getting them to vote. And clearly he had some success in energizing the vote to do that, right? Whereas on the other side, you saw a different strategy with the Biden campaign was, hey, let's go find some disaffected Republicans, and let's find women, let's find suburban voters, let's find rural voters. Two different strategies on trying to get elected. So we should also note that parties have an extra legal status, which means that parties are not provided for by law, nor are they prohibited by law. as I said earlier, parties grew up just because there was a need. People feel the need to organize. There's strength in numbers. All right. I'm going to split this lecture up. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about party organization because I feel we should take a little bit of break. And I'll talk about party organization. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and post this. So stay tuned. I'll have the second portion up later today. It's a shorter portion, trust me on this.